Okay, this is the installation instructions for the extended runtime fuel tank kit for the Yamaha EF2000iS. First step will be to remove the back cover of the generator. Actually, let me shut that fan off. I'm sure the microphone is picking up on that. Once you get the top screws out, the rest of the cover just unsnaps, and then you lift the bottom of it out. The bottom of it is held in place by these three cleats that slide into these holes. And then there are two round plugs here, and one here that snap into place. The first item to notice, if you look back in here, you'll see the fuel hose, and it's the one with the white dot on it. We're going to remove the end of the fuel hose that is connected to the fuel selector valve. Okay. The fuel hose is held in place by a Corbin clamp. And what you do to get it disconnected is you have to squeeze these two tabs together and just slide it out of the way. Normally it's right here at the end of the hose, connecting it to the hose barb. Squeeze the two tabs, move it back, and then grab the hose and slide it off of the barb. At this time, we're going to slide the hose out of the way. Now, you take the kit. Comes with 5 feet of hose, 1/4 inch, fuel filter, a bag of connectors, hose clamps, teflon tape, and a big fuel line. We're going to take the fuel pump, put it in place right here. You'll notice that there's a small tab of steel sticking out that the inverter module mounts to. We're going to drill a 9/64 hole right here, where we're going to run a sheet metal screw into that is included in the kit, and that's where it's going to be mounted. I'm going to drill the initial pilot hole with a 1/8 drill bit, and then I'll come back and drill it out to the finished size. The kit comes with 2 screws. I'm going to use one of the screws to kind of tap this hole out. Just work the screw in and out, and it'll cut just a little bit deeper each time. screws that are included in the kit, incidentally, are identical. So you use one screw to go ahead and cut threads into the metal. Once you've done that, make sure and throw that screw away, because it will damage the end of the screw slightly, cutting the threads. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a fuel manifold. One end of it is going to go to the back of the fuel selector valve. Another end is going to go to the top of the generator, which will connect to the fuel inlet. And in the third portion of the manifold is going to go through a fuel filter and to the inlet port on the pump. So what we're going to do is take the 1/4 inch hose that's included in the kit. We'll cut a 2-inch section of it. Then an 11-inch section. You open up the bag of hardware, you'll see a 1/4 inch fuel tee. Actually, there's 2 of them. They are identical. Take one of them, I get just a little bit of oil on the end of the fuel tee. Plug that in to the 2-inch hose. Get a little bit of oil on the other stem of the fuel tee. Connect the 11-inch hose like this. Then cut a 1.5 inch section . Put it onto the fuel tee in this position. Then take the fuel filter. Notice there's an arrow on the fuel filter and it points this direction. That's the direction of fuel flow. Connect it to this bottom piece of the fuel line, so it'll look like this. Then cut a 7-inch section of the fuel hose. And I'm going to cut this just a little bit longer, because I can always trim it shorter when I'm done. At this point, I'm going to open up the bag with the hose clamps. I'm going to put hose clamps on each of the connections. like this. Notice on the T-fitting, because the clamping portion of the hose clamps is fairly large, I face one this way and the other two up and backwards. And this is simply to create enough room. It doesn't matter if they're pointing straight up or back or whatever. You can rotate them around. It's just a whole lot easier if you don't have all three facing forward. And that's probably a good place to take a break. Okay, we're going to go ahead and put the fuel inlet fitting in the top of the generator. If you notice, right at the front of the web for the handle and out about 3/4 of an inch is where we're going to put the fuel fitting. If you stick your hand inside, you'll be able to feel some webbing inside the generator case, the plastic webbing, and it has foam over it. But you can feel where the plastic webs are, and you want to bullseye the spot right in the center of the webbing. Because of that, I'm first going to drill a 1/8 inch hole, where I'm eventually going to drill a 1/2 inch hole. The reason is, when I drill the hole through, I'm pretty much going by guess as to where it's going to come through at. Once I get it drilled through, then I can feel exactly where it is, and if I get it off by 1/8 of an inch, it's not a big deal, because the hole that I'm ultimately going to be drilling is going to be a 1/2 inch diameter. That actually looks really nice. So even with the front of the webbing straight out between 3/4 of an inch and 1 inch, the further you move it this way, the easier it is to screw the fuel fitting in from the top. If you go too close to the handle, you have to hold the fuel fitting right here steady and screw the hose barb on from the bottom. Now what I'm going to use to drill the final hole is a step drill. I use these because they are convenient and I'm possibly overconfident. I don't recommend them actually, because if you drill too deep, the hole is also too big. The end size of this hole is going to be just slightly larger than a 1/2 inch. So if you've got a 1/2 inch drill bit, you're probably safe to go ahead and use that instead. If you've used step drills before and you have one, then go ahead and use it. I don't advise buying one for this job because they are a little pricey too. So right now I've got the hole drilled to a 1/2 inch. And now there's foam on the inside of this cover, very much like this foam. And what I've done is I've just picked away a section of foam right around the hole that I drilled. Now I'm going to take a burring knife. You can either use a repairman's needle or a repairman's reamer or a burring knife or whatever, just to clean up the slag, because the plastic leaves a lot of slag on it. And I just want to clean that up. phone call. Okay, this is a quick disconnect fuel fitting. It'll be going into the top of the generator. And this is a hose barb that you'll be screwing onto the bottom. You'll notice that there is a gap between the hose barb and the fuel fitting. And what you'll do is tighten this down, and it will pinch against the plastic at the same time that these threads become good and tight. The first step is to take the roll of Teflon tape that's included in the kit and put it over the threads, being very careful not to overlap the end of the threads. Because if it overlaps the end of the threads, it can tear. So do not allow something like that to happen. Because if it does, when you screw the hose barb off, or screw the hose barb onto it, it can tear that piece of Teflon loose, and it may end up in the wrong spot. In all likelihood, it will actually just end up getting caught in the fuel filter. But there's always a possibility that it will end up somewhere else. So I'm going to hold the hose barb and just thread this fitting into it. Now you'll see what I mean. Drill this hole far enough out from the handle that you can actually screw the fuel fitting in from the top while holding the hose barb in place from the bottom, and it makes your job a lot easier. And just check it and make sure it's not pinching down on the plastic yet as it starts to tighten up, because I want it to end with the fittings pointing forward. And the reason is, when I hook the hose, okay, it's starting to pinch now. When I hook the fuel hose to it, I want the fuel hose to come up the front and lay right between the fuel cap and the handle, and then hook on here. That way it is extremely unlikely that the fuel hose will ever go near the back of the generator, keeping in mind the back of the generator here is where the hot exhaust gases come out, and we don't really want the fuel to be anywhere near there if we can possibly avoid it. Take our fuel manifold that we built. This hose is going to go forward and hook on to the fuel selector valve. This hose is going to go backwards and hook on to the hose barb that is attached to the bottom of this. Let me raise this card up a little bit. fuel hose is going to run behind the spark plug cap. The main reason, in fact the only reason I want it behind the spark plug cap is it just makes it easier to change the spark plug in the future. Because the spark plug is a service item, and once this fuel line is installed, it's pretty much going to live there. Now if you look, this hose is installed onto the bottom of the hose barb, and this hose is installed onto the back of the fuel selector valve. At this time I'm going to take two more hose clamps, put one holding it to the hose barb, the other holding it to the fuel selector valve. And that is probably as good a place as any to go ahead and take a break. Okay, if you look up in here, you can now see that there's a hose clamp on the bottom of the hose barb. And then if you look at the manifold, you'll notice that the fuel filter is centered between the recoil start mechanism and the back of the inverter module. If you need to pull it back off and trim the 2-inch section of hose that goes from the fuel T mentioned earlier to the fuel selector valve, then go ahead and pop it off and get that fuel filter as close to dead center as possible. It's not critical that it be dead centered, but if you do choose to later on, I'm working on an electric start for this, and hopefully the electric start for the Yamaha 2000 will not become the money pit that the electric starter for the Honda did. But at any rate, you'll need the fuel filter centered between the inverter module and the recoil start to do that. And as you can see, I've also got a hose clamp on the fuel line where it goes into the back of the fuel selector valve. Okay, the next item is going to be to take the fuel pump, and we've already drilled the hole here, and the solid black side is going to be facing out, not the side with the gold vent in it. If you'll look real closely at the fuel pump, you'll see that where the side with the one hose barb that comes out, if you'll look at it really closely, there's a small arrow pointing outward, and that's fuel output. And on this one, there's a small arrow pointing inward. That's where the fuel enters the fuel pump. And this has a letter P, which is the pulse line. So this is fuel output. So we'll connect the hose that goes to the carburetor to this one. And that has the factory Yamaha Corbin clamp still on it. And go ahead and put the fuel pump and just do a test fit. Make sure that the hole where the fuel pump goes is lined up, and then look at this hose and make sure that it does not touch the choke linkage, because if you've got a rubber hose touching a metal choke linkage, it will be choke linkage 1, rubber hose 0. Okay, this is the hose that comes from the input, so it'll go to the input fitting on the fuel pump, which will be this bottom hose barb right here. And I'm going to put one of the clamps that's included in the kit in that location. I'm not going to bolt the fuel pump down yet because it's nice and handy to be able to move the fuel pump around when you're working on it. When you put this clamp on, make sure you don't have the clasping portion of the clamp facing backwards. This is a fairly good angle to have it at because when it bolts in place, you don't want it to push the pump out away from the housing of the inverter module. It should allow the pump to bolt solidly to this tab. I'm going to turn it just slightly because it's just touching. Now it's got clearance. Okay, the third hose, which is this one, is going to go to the pulse line. Fortunately, on this generator, Yamaha has elected not to put a positive crankcase ventilation valve in, which simply makes our job easier. So what we'll do is take the breather hose loose from the intake right here. We'll mark the hose right where it starts to emerge from behind this plastic cover, and then we'll cut it here. Let's go ahead and take a break for just a moment. Okay, I've made a mark on the hose, and I was clever enough to use a black magic marker to mark a black hose with. Hopefully you can see the mark that I made. If you look, what I've done is right here is the edge of this plastic brace, and just slightly behind the edge of the plastic brace is where I've made the line on the hose. What I'm going to do is cut that hose right on the line. Be careful when you cut the hose. Do not cut the wires going to the stepper motor for the throttle. If you cut those wires, you'll be angry with yourself and possibly me, possibly everybody. So now you see that I have cut off a section of hose. Okay, this is the only section of hoses in the kit that will come pre-assembled, and that is because the lengths of each of the hoses and the exact positioning of the clamps is really critical to get it to fit. So the next step is take the piece of hose that we cut earlier and remove the remaining section that goes onto the spigot on the valve cover. And that section will not be reused. And you'll take this and the short portion of hose from the T will go right on to the valve cover in this location, which is where the stock one came off of. You may have to flex this out just a little bit in order to get this into place. And the goal is to try to get this hose all the way up to where it hits the aluminum of the valve cover. You should not see a whole lot of brass from the spigot that the hose is clamped onto. And if you look at the hose body, this wire is the one we were being very careful not to cut. It goes to the throttle stepper motor. I'm going to route this outside of the spigot on the intake that the original breather hose is going to connect back onto. So now you would take the piece of elbow that you cut off the breather hose, and if you're having trouble remembering which end was the end you cut, if you look, one end is probably going to be more jagged than the other. That is most likely the end that you cut. The Yamaha end will be cut nice and smooth. So the end you cut will go on to the new PCV valve, then it will slide on to the elbow on the intake. Move this clamp just a little bit. I don't like that, the way it's pushing. Now we look at it, make sure that nothing is restricting the choke movement. The cable for the throttle stepper motor goes behind this portion of the breather hose and then around this portion, and that way it keeps it well out of the way of the choke. This hose is the one that comes down out of the bottom of the T. You may have to trim this hose shorter. I've got this one, looks like it's going to come pretty close. Let's do a test fit. The goal is that with this hose connected up and the fuel pump bolted in place, that it will clear the air box, and that way the air filter will be much easier to change with the kit installed. Okay. So this comes around and it's nice and smooth. That's perfect. The next step is going to be to go ahead and put clamps. One right here. There was no clamp in this position stock, and that is because the stock purpose of this hose is simply to allow air pressure in the crankcases to be evacuated, and they just dump it into the air filter. The way this kit works is we take advantage of the shock wave that's created by the piston going down. It creates pressure in the crankcases, and we use that crankcase pressure to power the pulse fuel pump. The Yamaha EF2000 has such a small engine that it does not create a very strong pulse wave, so we cannot allow any of it to leak, because if it does leak, we will not have as much fuel pressure, or excuse me, as much of a fuel vacuum to pull fuel from a remote tank, and it will not allow us to place the tank lower than the generator. And we'd like the advantage of that to work. So we're going to put a clamp on this. Now our concerns with the leak are so that the shock wave that is transmitted by this hose, incidentally this hose does not carry any liquids whatsoever, no fuel, no nothing, it's just a shock wave of air. So we've got clamps all the way to the PCV valve, at which point after the PCV valve there's almost no pressure. I'm going to put another clamp right on the fuel pump. If the engine were larger and had a greater displacement and a much stronger shock wave, we would not need to worry about it so much. But this little bitty engine does not have a strong pulse wave at all, so we need to make sure and use every little bit of it. We cannot afford to spill any, so to speak. Okay. The next thing we want to do is look at all the fuel hoses, all the air lines and so forth. Make sure nothing is pinched. This is a nice smooth flow. This hose that comes out of the filter is a nice smooth flow. The hose that comes out of the quick disconnect is a nice smooth bend, and it goes straight forward to the connector, the T connector back there. Then the output hose on the fuel pump, which is the one that uses the stock Corbin clamp. If you remember earlier when we originally removed this hose from the back of the fuel selector valve, it is the one that had the dot of white paint on it. So I want to look back in here and make sure that this hose is not kinked. Actually, this one has a sharper bend than what I would like to see. What happens is, take this piece of hose and show you real quick. There's an S bend, and we'll say the carburetor is right here. And the hose comes out of the carburetor and then goes back this way and then turns around and comes back into the fuel filter or the fuel pump. So it's like this. And you'll notice that it has an opportunity to kink here and an opportunity to kink here, the way it's done. So what I'm doing is making the hose like this. I'm actually not shortening it 3 inches shorter, but as you can see, it makes it a much smoother bend. On this particular one, I'm going to shorten the hose about 3/4 of an inch. Now some of these units, because of manufacturing tolerances, Yamaha doesn't cut them at exactly the same length. This isn't a formed rubber hose, it's just a piece of fuel line. So some of the generators come off the assembly line a little bit longer, some come off the assembly line with the hose just a little bit shorter. So what we will do is we will cut a 3/4 of an inch piece off of that hose. And now, if you look, you see where that hose goes onto the carburetor, and it's going to come around and go on to the fuel pump. Let's go ahead and try this again. Another thing is when you're putting hoses on, make sure that they don't get twisted. Because if you run a hose around a corner or something and it's twisted, it will cause a chance for it to kink too, especially if it's in a binding area. So make sure that if you got a situation like this, let the hose untwist. You don't want to put any extra stresses on the hose. Put that screw back in place. See how it looks now. That actually looks a lot nicer. Let me remove the breather hose here so you can actually see it better. Try to tuck this out of the way. But this hose is the one I was talking about, and it now goes just missing the breather fitting and into an S bend and then down into the carburetor. So this way it's not kinked. Go ahead and put the breather fitting back on. I'm running the wiring harness from the throttle stepper motor outside of the breather hose, strictly to keep it completely away from the choke mechanism. And that's another thing you want to make sure of, is that just nothing hits the choke. When it runs full range of motion, you don't want it to come near anything. If you have any concerns that it's going to come near anything, there are zip ties included with the kit. If you feel you need to use them to zip tie things out of the way. Like if you wanted to put a zip tie around the breather hose versus the throttle stepper motor wiring harness, you could put one here. It's not absolutely critical, but I'll just put one on just as a demonstration. Then cut the end. Look over the system, make sure you haven't left any clamps off of any of the locations that they need to go on. None of the hoses are pinched. And this is probably as good a place as any to go ahead and take a break. Okay. The next part will be to install the cabinet. The cabinet goes on. There are 3 tabs in the bottom that hook in, and then these 3 bullets that snap in to the rubber grommets. So we'll hook the tabs into place, and then we'll just push rubber bullets and they'll snap in. Just pull the rubber flange from around the fuel cap to allow it to stick in there correctly. There are then 2 screws that hold the rear cover on. The kit comes with a decal, so in case the person operating it is not the same person that installed it, they can read the decal, and it tells how to operate the remote fuel system. And that's the exact same procedure that was covered in the product demonstration video, so I won't rehash that here. The kit has additional clamps left in it in case you break some or lose some. Plenty of additional zip ties left in it. It also has the quick disconnect fitting that you would screw into the fuel tank, whatever size fuel tank you choose. And it comes with a genuine Yamaha fuel hose. One of the quick disconnect fittings will hook onto the fuel tank. It will be the one with the silhouette of a fuel tank and the arrow pointing inward, because that's the direction of fuel flow from the tank. The other end, the one with the arrow pointing outward or towards the generator, hooks onto the generator. Now all we need to do is go ahead and take this outside and start it up and run it.